Hello, WarsawJS. So I'm Jacek Migdał, and at my day job, I'm kind of like cloud juggler. So pretty much I'm like a backend engineer, and I don't do any front end in my day job. That's my pure love to do some Meteor. And I work in my normal job on kind of like, SaaS, kind of like software as a service, which does a log. So if you got like a lot of Apache logs, server logs, your application logs, you could kind of like upload to Sumo Logic and figure out what's going on. If something is broken, why it's broken, and how to fix it. So maybe first quickly check, like who has heard about Meteor? Okay, who has downloaded Meteor and tried to write something in Meteor? Oh, okay, so I would probably not ask the next question. So it's very hard to tell like the story of the internet and what happened because it's like it happened so quickly and so many things happened. But if you kind of like simplify a lot, there is kind of like, I would say, three main events, at least for me. Initially, computers were like super, super expensive, The initial computers were size of about this room. There were kind of like mainframes, cost, like several years of salary of people, So what do you do with that kind of expensive stuff? Or you want to use it as much as possible. So back then, people invited kind of like terminals. So you have kind of like dummy computer, which is pretty much keyboard and screen. You connect to this kind of like real computer, which was mainframe at that time, and boom, you invented client-server model, right? Then there was like 20 next years, like a lot of interesting happens, but what happened in kind of like early 90s was kind of like the web. Like there was like guy working at CERN, you probably know this story, finding documents was really hard. So he figured out, the URL address. So kind of like if you type google.com, it translates to some address. Then there is like, this text with links called HTML, and that's how it started. And because, the client-server model was like so popular, he pretty much, used it, right? Then next 10 years, a lot of things has happened. But what has changed, is like, these websites are not just, like, kind of like, pages with links, with images, they're like application. Like if you use like Facebook, Twitter, there's like so much logic going on that pretty much, like, that's hard to imagine, 40 years ago, right? And also kind of like mobile, it used to be that you use computers, right now we have like all of sorts of different devices. And how did we get there? Like the beginning of web is kind of like, it wasn't kind of like a big project that somebody started. Actually a lot of people started doing like big projects, but all of them has failed. Initial web was like, bored researcher who in his spare time created pretty much the web. And a lot of technology started that way, like JavaScript, like 10 days, probably kind of like the shortest language that was created, and it's like kind of like amazing how it's popular, given that it was just created in 10 days. And if you look at that pattern, there was like Ajax, long polling, things that, initial was kind of like hack, that you pretty much kind of like toddler, which is like crying all the time, and it was hard to use, but at some point, that became norm, right? So what else shaped this kind of like revolution? It was like, it wasn't like planned, there was like a lot of competing technologies. So each time, in each wave, there was like a few technologies, like at first JavaScript was supposed to be kind of like toy language to check if you have like number in your field, but like Java applets were supposed to be way to go. And has anybody still using Java applets? Dinosaurs, anybody? Wow. And there was also like this idea that we could have like HTML same as XML, and you have some doc type definition, which seems to be like a great idea of the time, but it failed. There is like Flash, which is like dying a bit slower, but it's also like dying. There was like browser wars, there was like Netscape, Internet Explorer, then Internet Explorer fighting with Firefox, and Firefox with Chrome, all sorts. So if you look like what happened, it's almost like kind of like a nature that, there is like some wave of technology, like here, then, we try to do something, something seems to be like great idea, but they didn't work out, so they die. And the other, goes further, we create technology on top of that, like JavaScript. And that's pretty much how it works. And the third thing, what I think is like really important, is like there was like so much money involved in the game, right? Because there's like a whole wave of companies which are, you know, worth like dozens or even like hundreds of $billions that pretty much, you know, are based on web, kind of like Google, Facebook, Amazon. So a lot of people got like incentive, though, you know, JavaScript was hacked in 10 days, to make it like really fast, make browsers support everything, you know, like, you know, tabs, you know, you almost, if you look at the Chrome browser, it's almost like operating system for like late 90s, right? So actually, those technologies improved. So that's why web was like so successful, and that's why we are here. That's why it's all about JavaScript. But you know, like this mode of like evolution that you kind of like create small increments and then see what catches on, goes its limits, right? See like a nature. Like, you know, there's like a lot of animals, they survived many catastrophes, but you know, if you look at humans, we kind of like created kind of like really powerful toys, kind of like planes, cars, you know, like pretty much everything in that room is like created by humans, right? So it's not kind of like, you know, maybe evolution, it's more kind of like design systems. And I kind of like believe web kind of like this design thinking, you know, everything was like a hack that somehow survives, right? So what would we do if we kind of like started from scratch, right? Because, you know, there's just one language supported by browsers, JavaScript. Why I have to learn another language, right? If there is like so many platforms, why don't target them all? Why couldn't we have like a platform that supports like also like mobile and a lot of other things? The third thing is kind of like reactive by default. Like, I don't know if all of you know what reactive means, but probably all of you know that there is like refresh button in your browser. So reactive means that you no longer need that refresh button. Like Facebook, you know, there's like new updates coming on your website and you don't need to do anything. You use like Gmail, you know, also like new emails came and you don't need to click that refresh button. So reactive means that pretty much you could like propagate any changes back to the user, right? And what if that would be kind of like default behavior, not something that you have to work so hard to achieve it? Also, like I would think, you know, we all know that, you know, there's like so many applications, we want to write so many things, but we usually struggle to write even like a few of them. So I would like technology that makes me so much more productive, right? And I think we also have like notation that websites are pretty much programs, right? So let's maybe do like a little demo here. So you could pretty much, maybe like one word from audience, like some random word that I haven't made it before. Like some fruit, like what kind of fruit? Like apple, okay. Right. So let's maybe do it, let me do it. So pretty much let me create right now, because Meteor is like so easy, let me create like a app, like WarsawJS app, right? And let's see how it works, right? Oh, yeah. And also, like in meantime, let me just point it to localhost, right? WarsawJS app. And let's say, like, what's the modern app that I could like create in like a minute or like two in presentation? I would say like a chat, right? Why not create like a chat, right? So, right? So I just have like a file, just started like a development server, and let's say, give it like a few seconds, and we have like welcome to Meteor, right? But you know, like welcome to Meteor, but I would rather say, you know, welcome WarsawJS, right? And what do you notice? I haven't clicked any restart. Wow, magic. It's reactive. Also, like I make any change to code, it happens, right? So time for chat, right? So let's create like a button. I also need like some text field, right? right? And also like magic happens. Once I save it, it will be there, right? And also I will need probably somehow to display it, right? So that's kind of like templating language of Meteor, which pretty much works in a way that you kind of like the same kind of like similar templating in kind of like there like in Angular or React, right? And let's one last thing here, which is like pretty much some text, right? And let's go to do some logic, right? So this thing we probably need. So I would probably need like some way to store messages. So Meteor is based on Mongo, right? So I pretty much want to create like a Mongo collection, which is called messages. Boom, done. Then I would like to display my messages. There is like so far nothing here, right? But let's write something. So pretty much the way what I want to do is like I would like to display messages, right? And I would also love to display them in order, right? So let's right? Find. I want all messages, and the only thing that's interesting for me, I want to sort by time, and I want kind of like ascending order, right? So we have like messages, and let's do some action, right? So let's do like click of a button, right? Right? So the other interesting feature of Meteor, because it also like works in a browser, I could like write like console log and then use to figure out what's there, right? So I could pretty much could use kind of like jQuery syntax to see if I could find input element, right? And let me try if that would work, right? So let's wait for a while, do inspect website, use like console log, where is like event? No, I need to also have like a chat. So it's like very helpful because it's giving me a message here. Let's do it. Okay, and I'm starting something, and what I could see, I already have like input here, and I could find that element with the input here that's already finding, right? So let's so I pretty much want to save my value of my input. It's usual jQuery syntax, so it's like just var, and I just want to add message. Okay, and welcome. Right? Works. You know. And maybe that doesn't seem for you a lot, but let me just add one more thing to like clear that text once I enter it. Right? And the interesting thing, it will work also with the other people. Right? So let me add like one more feature because it's like pretty dummy that I have like text here. Right? So hello, right? And let's make something interesting. Let's add like a new tab, right? Let's copy that website. And you see, hi, right? One to other. That's like a chat. So let's maybe go back to presentation. But maybe in the meantime, if I was able like to create chat pretty much during the presentation, like a few minutes, let's maybe see if I could also like deploy it by the presentation end, right? No, Warsaw, Apple, Meteor. Okay. And why is deploying that code publicly online? So how works Meteor? Pretty much if you want to start from it, you could kind of like, first you need to do like some templating, which is pretty much kind of like, I would say, they're using Blaze, which is kind of like equivalent to what you know from like Angular or kind of like React. And then you define some logic. And this logic could either work on a client on a server. In that particular example, it works on a client. So here I'm handling like some input. That was like a bit different, because it was like live coding, you always got code a bit differently. And you also got some kind of like helper to display these images. And how does it work? It works like from the kind of like, that was kind of like from the developer perspective, but the other perspective, it's pretty much, Meteor is kind of like a wrapper on top of Node.js, and it's using by default database MongoDB. And what's different, it doesn't have this kind of like notation of you are making some HTTP calls. You are just synchronizing database, right? So pretty much here, you got kind of like the main database, and any client could tell you, oh, I'm interested in this sort of the information, and that's how I'm changing it. And this propagation of information just happens by Meteor, right? It's also got like some built-in templating, which is kind of like, but you could also use Angular or React if you feel more familiar with it. The example would be like tiny bit more complicated, but you could do it. And it also got like packaging system, right? And why it's cool? First of all, because you could do like hot code reload. You don't need to wait for anything. You just do it, it happens. Second, every people tell you, that the website sucks on mobile, and the native apps are the way to go. Why? Because mobile phone doesn't have like a great internet connection. So most of the website, if you click something, this information goes to the server. It's like server does something, it goes to the by client, it goes over like multiple countries, and then you see something. But on mobile, you want to have like instant reaction, right? So if you have your local database copy on your application, you could do it really quickly, because you could simulate what would happen on the server and do it immediately. So you have like a website which works as well as native app, right? That's optimistic UI. And if server disagree with you because there is like some permission issue, you could roll that change back, right? It also got like native mobile support. If you create like a website, you probably won't also publish kind of like app to iOS. For example, if you create kind of like Uber competitor, it would be like really hard to convince people, to use like Uber. So it's by Cordova, you could kind of like, support like Android from the same, and also like iPhone from the same code base. It also supports like ECMAScript. So it could like compile kind of like, the newest JavaScript, and even support like other browsers. And it's very modular. So you could like, by default, it got everything what you need, but if you don't like something, you could change it, right? And so how it's different, like how it compares to Django Rails. So what I believe, like Meteor is kind of like, this technology that lets you create like the whole app from beginning to end. While a lot of other technologies were kind of like they're much older, kind of like Django Rails. They just pretty much tell us mostly like server what kind of like HTML is served to the customer. React Angular is great, but they just work on the client. Like you need do some backend even to use them. And Node.js is like, cool, but it's just, lets you write on JavaScript. And Meteor pretty much got featured from all of these technologies. So what I think, train is kind of like Rails, because, trains on Rails. The Statue of Liberty, I think, is kind of like React Angular. And this plane is kind of like Node.js. But, the Meteor is kind of like this huge ship that could cover almost all of it, right? And why now? If that would be, that simple, why this technology hasn't existed, like 10 years or 20 years ago? And the answer is pretty much, in the beginning of the presentation. Like all of these devices, like computers, mobiles, are like super powerful. Also, like the technologies behind those, like browsers, also like way more powerful than they were kind of like 10 years ago. And also, like from your own perspective, it used to be that whatever you create, people say it was awesome. Right now, people compare you to the Facebook or Uber app. Even if you just like a single person kind of like mobile shop. So, the consumer applications set really high bar, but these companies got like, dozens or like hundreds of millions for development. You are just alone, so, it's better to use some technology that lets you do that, right? And it's also like, software salaries are really high at this point. So, because they're high, you should also show that, you could bring value from that salary, right? And so, I think like you should all try to build your next app in Meteor, and that's super simple. Just visit the website, right? Then copy that little line and create something. I personally find Meteor like so intuitive that I'm confident to use it during live coding on presentation, and I'm like backend developer, you know, like, so why don't you create something, you know, have fun, you know, you don't even need to read tutorials that much, and that's pretty much it. So it's time for questions. By the way, is that website working? Because I haven't, you know, checked it. Let me just check it. Oh, it looks like it might be working, right? So by the end of the presentation, I not only like written up from scratch using nothing but regular Meteor, and you know, oh, people are spamming me. Okay, works. And I would ask a question, and there's like one more thing, that if I was like thinking about organizing like one-day workshop about Meteor, so if anybody's interested, grab your mobile phone, you know, note that email, you know, or send immediately that I'm interested, you know, and that's it.
All right, thank you, Jacek. I think there are a lot of questions, so the first one here.
Okay, so could you show us the example how to use Meteor.js with Angular, or could you at least tell us how to do it?
I personally know that it works. I've seen example. I haven't used it myself. So I prefer not to do it during like this talk. I could like try to do it later, because I kind of like, you know, I'm not front-end developer, so you know, everything was new to me, so like why learn some even more? Okay. Or maybe that would be like a good idea, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Right, any other questions? Maybe some criticism?
For example, if a user on his mobile phone enters around 10 chat messages, but he suddenly went offline during the submissions, will those submissions propagate to the server eventually?
Yeah. So by default, if you don't refresh the browser, the answer is yes. Pretty much it knows that I need to propagate those messages, and then, you know, it will wait until it will reconnect. So that's why it's also like great for mobile.
And if there was an error, the server refused to accept those messages?
Then you pretty much, you know, remove those data from the client. You got like opportunity to react on that, but there is, you know, like a chance, because you simulate something on client. You know, the classical example is like you play like a game. You press like a button, right? And both client could think, you know, I've pressed first and I will win, but the server makes kind of like the final decisions, right? So like everything on client is just like a simulation, which in 95% of cases would be the same what server does, but in some cases it might be different.
Is there any indication for the user that he's offline?
You could do it. You have like information, and you could like in your application, you could kind of like have like, I'm on offline, you know, everything, and if, you know, please be cautious, right? It's like, you know, you could do it the same way as Gmail has, you know, or some of these apps, you know, like, oh, I'm trying to reconnect to server in something.
Sounds great.
Oh, there's like a question there.
I'm interested in how actually it communicates with the server. Does it use WebSockets or Ajax requests or something like that?
So by default, it uses like WebSockets. You don't deal with it directly, but pretty much the whole communication is kind of like the own protocol called DDP, which is like, I would say mostly used by WebSocket, but it could fail back to like long polling for some like really long clients, or if you're like behind firewall that doesn't let you do WebSockets.
And do you have any experience how many clients can it handle on the server?
So I built like an app that I was able like on kind of like single server. I haven't hit the limit, but I was able like easily without doing any optimization work to have like 1,000 clients on like a single server. And that was kind of like Hacker News submission. and it works, right? And of course there are like limits. It's like this technology is like way more resource expensive from the server point of view than kind of like I would say others, kind of like Django or Rails. So you need to be extra careful. But there is also a kind of like commercial product from this Meteor, because the Meteor is kind of like open source project, but there is like company behind it that you could pretty much rent servers from them if you're like really, if you want huge amount of clients. So I would say this technology is great if you're building some kind of like application where you kind of like log in, but if you want to do something like really, really massive, you need to be prepared to do some extra work.
Okay, so maybe last question. Is it possible to install it on multiple servers or just one machine?
Yes, you could install it on many servers, but there is like, most servers, kind of like Django, are stateless. So it doesn't matter if you're connecting to different server between requests. Meteor, because it takes care of your database, it updates you, requires that server remember each client to connect to it, and it's like stateful, right? So it's like you need to be a bit more careful with that kind of like architecture, but yes, people done that before, It's like.
Thank you, Jacek, very much.
Thank you.